Greetings, friends! Wandengruzki here, and this is the weekly Russian Ukrainian War update for the week of July 29th through August 4th of 2024. And if you want to continue receiving these Russian Ukrainian War updates, be sure to subscribe to my channel to keep getting these weekly updates. Alrighty, and this week we have a ton of updates along the entire front. So, the Russian breakthrough from Porez that happened last week has continued, and this is, I call it the Porez flower, because, before, the Russians, had a pretty kind of a flat front line, kind of going from, along the Vochashka River, but the Russians have used the rail line to kind of penetrate into the Ukrainian Pokrovsk defenses, and from there, the flower of Porez is blooming. They are moving to the south here. They're moving to the north. They're moving to the west and to the north. So everywhere you see, the Russians are expanding. And this week we're going to talk about those expansions. Let's go from the north and down here. First, the Russians have taken complete control of the village of Timofeevka this week. This was a logical extension after the fall of Porez and the encirclement of the Ukrainians in this pocket. Ukrainian sources say they were able to leave, but regardless, Ukrainians who were trying to be holding up to to the south of Lushitska in this area, general area, had to fall back, and because of that, Timofeevka has fallen. The Russians are able to hold this village because to the north of it is the Kerensky-Turetsk River, which gives the Russians some extra defenses. So the Ukrainians that are in the fields to the north here, right here, will have a harder time attacking Timofeevka directly. And this allows them to continue using this Kerensky-Turetsk River as a natural defense as they try to cut off the defenses in Ivanivka and these three villages from the north here. So the village of Ivanivka has been stormed by the Russians, and they managed to capture the village. They also managed to capture a tree line in front of it. So Timofeevka has fallen, and I have no doubts that right now the Russians are going to try to advance basically along these tree lines and use the river to the north as a natural defense, and then try to storm these two small little villages of Lichniki and Serodonivka here. And so, in order to start cutting off Ivanivka from the north. We also, so Timofeevka has fallen, and this is the first step for the Russians to continue. Probably going to use the Kerensky-Turetsk River to kind of have as a chain, or like a setting position, in the sense of that, the Russians might start moving towards Pokrovsk, and they might use this river as a natural defense, just as they use the railroad as a natural defense in Avdiivka. So right now, taking Timofeevka is the first step in that. As we go more to the south here, we got news by the end of the week that the Russians are storming Ivanivka directly. They have taken the southern half of the village, and now battles are going on for the center of the village. We don't have any geolocated confirmation of this. However, most mappers have confirmed that the Russians are battling for the center of Ivanivka. And the Ukrainians are going to battle for this very hard, because if Ivanivka falls, then, the Russians will have a very good chance of basically mopping up everything here. And then, as you can see, then they could start the battle for Gorgorivka here, which is one of the main cities. I talked about this last week, but the Ukrainians have a lot of big cities that could help hold the Russians back from Pokrovsk. That is Gordivka, Novy Gordivka, and Selidova. And these kind of interlink with each other almost, and so they could actually kind of hold the Russians back. But if, say, Gordivka falls and the Russians manage to storm it from the south, but also from the north here, and they're able to do that once they take Ivanivka, then they could take Gordivka, and then they could just bypass. And then they could just bypass Novy Gordivka from the north, and and this would when one link of the chain falls, then the entire chain falls. So if Gordivka falls, then Novy Gordivka would be in a more precarious position, and then if Novy Gordivka falls, that puts Selidova in a very precarious position. That would so they really need to hold on to Gordivka, and that's why I think they're going to try to battle for Ivanivka as long as they can. However, the Russians have entered this village, and have captured at least the southern outskirt, the southern part of it, I should say. And because of that, we know that the Russians are expanding out from the rail line. They kind of use the rail line to go south, but they've also been they don't want to make this a complete salient. So they captured the fields obviously here. They've captured the fields between Ivanivka and Vesele. And also, as we move south in this Porez flower, we also got some confirmation, in fact, geolocated confirmation that the Russians are expanding to the south of Vochki, that they have captured basically this entire field to the south here. And so this was expected. The Russians already had control of the fields to the east here, and so now they've taken over these fields to the north of Zalizne. And so these fields, so they're taking the fields that are to the south of the rail line. And one thing, as we continue going to the south here, let's talk about Vesele. We talked about I think we talked about how the Russians entered Vesele last week. But in any case, we now have a geolocate confirmation. So we saw Russian troops actually getting bombarded by the Ukrainians right here. So we know for certain that the Russians have completely captured the village of Vesele. Again, this is another village that had to be taken in order to start trying to outflank Gordivka from the south. And now that Vesele has fallen, and they'll probably help try to take Ivanivka, and then from there, you're going to start trying to maybe reach these tree lines right here, and start probably trying to attack Zuradovka and Orlovka here to start trying to cut the Gordivka and Novi Gordivka communication lines. So Vesele has completely fallen to the Russians. And as we continue going south, one of the main targets of the Russians is Zalizne. Zalizne in the north, in terms of Ukrainian defenses on the west bank of the Vochka River, Zalizne is the main defense of the northwest. So everything that was like kind of right here basically is kind of held by Zalizne because it's the biggest town and it's on the high ground as compared to most of these other villages. Not too much of a high ground, but still on higher ground. And so everything, right, and what we got confirmation of, or at least what mappers are saying, is the Russians have taken over the Zalizne railway station, this area right here. They continue moving south. And I think that, and the Russians are basically using this railroad as a natural defense. And I think they're able to do this up until they reach Novi Gorivka, at which point they might stop. But right now they split the Serifka and Zalizne defenses, and a lot of sources are saying basically this week the Russians are preparing to storm Zalizne from the west here and occupy kind of this residential area, and then the Russians are also right on the northern outskirts of Zalizne after taking the field to the south of Vochki. So the Ukrainians are in a bit of a pickle here. The Russians are obviously going to make quick work of these residential areas. The Ukrainians can have some of these farms as natural defense. Some which could add some more extra defense on the eastern side of Zalizne. But once the Russians take the residential area here, which will be the first goal, the Russians will be able to attack from the north and then attack, from the south here. They might even start advancing towards this tree line right here and along this rail line, and then, cut off Zalizne from the south. And, then, the Ukrainians will be in a very big of a pickle in Zalizne there. So the Ukrainians still occupy almost all of Zalizne, but now that the train station has fallen and the Russians are right on the outskirts of both the western and the north, I could, there's going to be a big battle for Zalizne, and I'm not sure if the Ukrainians will be able to hold on much longer there. As we also see here, the Russians have taken the southern part of Zagirivka, and I have no doubts that after the fall of Vesele, the Russians will continue moving north here and try to capture this entire area here with Vesele, and create conditions for reaching the southern outskirts of Gordivka, and from there also taking Timofivka, Sernivka, Novotoretska, and Ivanivka, and then kind of having the front line be like this, so they could reach the eastern outskirts of Gordivka here. So, and then once that happens, then that's step one. Step two will then be as they try to split the Gordivka-Novi Gordivka axis by taking these two villages, and then and then the main problem will be this Terrakon right here, because they'll have to then, once they take these two villages, they'll have to try to take Krasnoyar, Kuridovaya Yar, and Mykolaievka here, but and then kind of split between Novi Gordivka and Gordivka here. But right now, they still need to clear up Zagirivka, they still need to clear up Zalizne, they still need to clean up Ivanivka. But the first steps of this plan is coming into motion, and this maybe the Ukrainians are like, we can't guard these villages, but once we retreat back to Gordivka, Novi Gordivka, this will give them a more better defense line, and they could reconstitute their defenses, because the Ukrainian defenses here have been completely they're not as strong, obviously, as we see there, because this is unexpected for this war. Usually we see small gains every week, but this is like, we see a lot of major gains in this Pokrovsk axis here. Also, we have some mappers saying that the Russians are now moving southwest from Novoslivka Pershi, and are basically using the Vuchka River to hold their flank, and they are now reaching the village of Mozova. They're basically trying to clear the Ukrainians from this side of the Vuchka River. So the Russians advanced and occupied these fields right here. So now it looks like the Russians are going to try to take Mozova and probably go up to here. And we shall see how the Russians try to basically clear the Ukrainians out from these tree lines here and force them to retreat back to the other side of the Vuchka River here. So yeah, a lot of advances for the Russians here, a lot of good advances, and based on these level advances, maybe by the end of next week, maybe in a week or two, we might see the step one be accomplished. We could see. We could see Gordivka starting to be cut off by the end of August. And obviously taking this big town itself will be a bit of an ask, but we could definitely see the processes of that. During the fall, the Russians will have everything set up so that during the fall campaign, they could start taking Gordivka out and starting to cut off Novaya Gordivka. But I don't see the battle for Pokrovsk happening until about maybe the winter at the very earliest. But the fall will definitely be focused on trying to take Novigorivka, Gordivka, and reaching the southern part of Pokrovsk and Mitrograd here. Alrighty, so that's the Pokrovsk axis. A lot of gains for the Russians, and we shall watch this with great interest. Also, again, the Russians will also try to, encircle these places from the north. So I expect that, they're not just going to hold here. I think they're going to move from Timofivka and try to finally take Vozhenivka here, because that's the last village they need to take before they could reach the Konstantinivka-Pokrovsk highway, and cutting it is something they need to do in order to start choking out Pokrovsk. Alrighty, we're now going to move to another area where the Russians are making a lot of rapid progress, and that is the Touretsk axis. I thought this would never, they would never attack here, a few months ago, but they did, and there's a lot of gains this week. The first major is that the Russians have captured entirely the town of Zalizne. This is one of the main towns that were, there's a lot of towns here that are so Touretsk itself is here. This is Touretsk. And so, as you can see, Touretsk itself is still has not been anything has been captured by the Russians in Touretsk. However, that's because the Ukrainians have a bunch of towns and natural defenses that held the Russians back in their 2014 lines. However, this week the Russians have pushed and are taking all these towns and natural defenses that could lead them to start assaulting Touretsk itself. And Zalizne is one of them. And basically this week, we saw basically geolocated confirmation the Russians have completely captured the residential area of Zalizne. This entire area has been captured by the Russians this week. So, a lot of progress. It looks like the Ukrainians just retreated from the residential areas and retreated back to these forests right here and back to Touretsk itself. And this is a very good progress for the Russians. I'll talk about why. Also, the two things the Russians are trying to achieve is to take Panichnya and Zalizne, because taking Panichnya will allow them to encircle this Terrakon, which is the number one thing they need to take, and then also taking Zalizne they'll be able to take this other Terrakon right here. Taking these two Terrakons and the front line kind of being along like this will then allow the Russians to then start operations to encircle Touretsk and attack directly towards it. Now, the Ukrainians have a lot of defenses here. They have another smaller Terrakon here. They have a high-rise building section here. They have a bunch of Terrakons right here, which will give them the high ground advantages if the Russians want to enter this residential area. Touretsk is a very big city, and has I think 60,000 people or so. It's a pretty big town, and so if the Russians want to take it, it's going to be a lot of it's going to be a big ask, but before they could even assault it, they need to take these 2 Terracons. And in terms of this Terracon right here in Zalizne, they are making good progress in that respect. We have geolocated confirmation the Russians are in this section right here, and not only that, they are now trying to reach this electrical substation. Lots of sources say that by the end of this week, there are battles for this substation. And so this will help give the Russians a kind of like a little small fortress in the south here. It looks like also that so they are outflanking the Terracon from the south. We also have confirmation the Russians are in the north here. We got geolocated footage of the Russians being in this area right here. They are trying to reach the cemetery, and so they are outflanked from the north. And so from this, I could expect that by the end of next week, the Russians will storm this Terracon, and the front line will go something like this. And from there, I think the Russians will then focus on another axis here. Now, before we talk about that axis, let's talk about some more gains in this new. So the Russians are also expanding in Penichia, though not as fast as in Zalizne. The Russians managed to capture these residential areas this week, and the Ukrainians still have a few of these buildings that help protect this Terracon. But the Russians are having a bit of a hard time clearing out the residential areas of Penichia, like right here and right here. I was expecting some more rapid gains there, but it seems that it's a bit harder. So the Russians will have to clear these residential areas of Penichia before they could attack Toretsk. So they are making some small gains, and I expect throughout the month of August, they'll try to move along the Liana Road and try to capture at least this residential area, and then from there they might try to advance into these residential areas right here, and then from there they'll be able to outflank the this Terracon right here, which is needed. So small gains in Penichia, but a lot of gains in Zalizne, and I expect that by the end of next week the Russians will take their first Terracon, and continue making progress in the Penichia, Druzhba towns. Now, the capture of Zalizne is actually pretty more important than Penichia. They both need to be taken in order to start attacking Toretsk directly. But one awesome thing about Zalizne for the Russians is that this helps them with the battle for New York, and there's been a lot of changes in the New York direction as well. Now, one of the biggest developments is that, the Russians have reached this area, and, they're right now battling for this substation. And one thing is that the Russians are also are about to encircle all the Ukrainians that are going to be in these 2014 kind of front line right here. So the Ukrainians are defending this flank here. These are natural defenses that helped hold the Russians off. But now that the Russians are in New York behind them and in Zalizne to the north of them, they are in a very big risk of a massive encirclement. There's like some sources are saying about 1,000 Ukrainians here. So we'll have to see, if the Ukrainians decide to retreat, if they decide to fall back. But the Russians are making rapid gains because they're getting closer to closing the pincers, and it's actually a bit harder for the Ukrainians because it's not like these are just open fields. We have a bunch of like these lakes and this water reservoir right here. And this makes it a lot harder for there's not a lot of land. The Ukrainians have, not a lot of land left to try to pass through the Russians. Let's say the Russians take the substation and advance to the water reservoir right here from the north here, and all the Russians have to do is reach the water reservoir from the south here. They just have to take like 2 more tree lines here. And if that happens, then the Ukrainians are surrounded here. There's no longer any way to retreat. So the Ukrainians are about to be encircled in this area. Let's talk about also in New York here. As we mentioned, the Russians expanded their bridgehead on the northern side of the Kuritsky-Toretsk River here and managed to capture these residential areas right here. And the Russians will probably continue trying to clear these eastern outskirts of New York, and but they'll probably try to advance, take this last street here, and then advance along this road to reach the this area here, to reach the reservoir. So there's a lot of the Russians are basically cutting New York off from their defenders in the eastern defenses here, but they also are going to slowly, cut these defenses entirely from the entire front line. So Russian progress are here. The Russians are also making progress on the more western side of New York. We saw sources say the Russians have taken, I believe it's like a brake factory or machine building plant, these areas right here, and they basically have cut this main road that connects New York to the western, to the other. So this road, one of the main road supplies that that supplies New York has been cut. That being said, the Ukrainians will still be able to supply New York from the north here. So the northern route is still open, but the western route has been compromised, which compromises the defenses that in in these villages right here that help Ukrainians in the fields to the west of New York. So I have no doubt now that since the Russians have taken positions in right here and have taken these like kind of small little factories here, the machine building plant and the bread factory, the Russians will probably try to clear this residential area and secure their. Not only are they taking the eastern residential areas, and are now taking the western part. And the Ukrainians still have They still have central New York. They have this factory that they could hold on to. They have some of these high-rise building areas in the center of New York. So the Ukrainians can still hold out, but I don't think the Russians will attack them directly. They're gonna Once they cut off these areas, the Russians will try to probably advance towards Naplivka and cut off New York directly. And the Russians will probably try to take this residential area to the northwest here, and then cut off the center of New York completely. So it kind of looks like a Lego hand about to encircle New York here. The Russians are also improving the flanks here. Sources are saying that the Russians have advanced up to these tree lines right here, going towards Pentelemonovka here. And the Russians will continue improving their I'm pretty certain the Russians will probably try to take this area right here, take this tree line right here and improve their western defenses so that when they take the western part, the residential part of New York, they could have a front line that goes like this, and they could hold off any Ukrainians that try to deep blockade New York. So that's the Tourette's axis. A lot of gains for the Russians there as well. This is kind of the most interesting part of the front line. Let's go to the South Donetsk area. Now, we talked about the capture of Krasnogorivka by the Russians last week, and the Russians are now at a bit of a slowdown in operations here because obviously they took the main part, but they still need to have a lot of. I talked about last week, but there's still a lot of things for the Russians to do here, and they've continued making small gains here. The Russians, after they captured everything up to this point here, continued their advance. They captured this street right here, and they have basically reached the Lozova River. Now, to the north of the Lozova River is where the Ukrainians could still hold on. They have pretty good defenses here. So, this residential area is to the north of the Lozova River, along with these farms. And the Russians, they captured these in order to keep pushing the Ukrainians away from Donetsk. But they have a river that helps slow down Russian operations. But the Russians have reached, basically captured everything to the south of this river, and now they're going to be able to, they're probably going to stop and focus more on this western part right here because it's easier. And the Russians have been doing that. The Russians are starting to advance along this residential area, and they have captured these residential areas right here. So the Russians will continue advancing along this area using the Lozova River and reservoir as a defense, and the Ukrainians will still hold on to the north here, but the Russians are going to try to push the Ukrainians to the west away from Krasnogorivka. And then this will help push the Ukrainians further back to Hostra and cut off the Ukrainians that are a flanking nuisance in Russian positions as they advance towards Maslianovka, and they're trying to push the Ukrainians back to this line. And then from there, they'll be able to start focusing to the north and clearing the last 2014 defenses and push the Ukrainians away from Novolska and such like that, pushing them back to the Vochka River here. So the Russians are still making small gains at Krasnogorivka because there's, while they captured the town, there's still a lot of work to do to take its outer suburbs, and there's still a lot. It's symbolically important, but there's still some tactical stuff they need to do in order to actually have good tactical positioning there. There's also been a lot of big changes, not big change, but a lot of big updates in the Ugledar direction here. We got confirmation the Russians have physically cut the 532 highway between Ugledar and Konstantinivka, which was the main highway advance here. Now that doesn't mean Ugledar is completely cut off. The Ukrainians could still use the fields, but cut. We got confirmation of the Russians planting a flag in one of the vehicles here. And I have no doubt that we saw confirmation that the Russians did a Leroy Jenkins movement and disembarked units here, I believe. So I have no doubt that this road's probably already been cut. Maybe, but maybe the Russians aren't like in it, but the Ukrainians aren't able to use this. But the Russians are able to be on this at will. But anyway, it's been cut, and I have no doubt that the Russians will clear out the fields to the south here and make this road unusable for the Ukrainians. Now, the Ukrainians have a lot of defenses more to the north of the highway. They have the coal mine here. They have a Terracon right here. I think this is also another coal mine. So the Ukrainians have the high ground advantage in Vodana here, which also helps Ugledar. But cutting this highway was a major blow to the supply of Ugledar, and Ugledar might be a focus for the Russians during the winter campaign. We also got confirmation that the Russians are definitely in the southwestern outskirts of Konstantinivka right here. We basically got geolocated footage of that. However, we have not seen. I think we got that last week as well, but most mappers have confirmed that. But we don't know if the Russians have been able to expand their control here. But we shall see if the Russians continue expanding their control in Konstantinivka, because they want to capture this village in order to fully secure their flank and then fully cut off Ugledar. We also saw some changes to the north here. Obviously, the Russians are doing what they did in Novomikhailivka and Konstantinivka. They did an assault south of Pobeba and managed to capture these fields here. And some sources are saying that they are clearing out the fields here, that there's right now clearing and mine clearing between Perestorivka and Pobeba. And this is basically the Russians clearing these fields. Is the Russians basically preparing themselves to try to take these farms and these dachas to the north of Konstantinivka, and start encircling Konstantinivka from the north here, just as they did in Novomikhailivka. So the Russians are cutting off Konstantinivka from the south. They have entered them in the southwest, and they are trying to clear the fields here and enter Konstantinivka from the north. So this is all for Ugledar, which is a big. We shall see how this develops. But right now, the focus will be on Konstantinivka, and once that falls, then they might start focusing on Ugledar. But I expect Ugledar, Konstantinivka might take the rest of the summer, might even go into like this fall and all that. There's been no changes on the Kherson front. However, in the Zaporozhye front, we got some map changes that basically shows that the Russians have improved. They've captured these fields here to the northwest of Robotyne, and basically secured better positioning between Kopany and Robotyne. And remember, the Ukrainians were trying to storm Kopany because they wanted to take this village in order to secure their flanks here. Because remember, the Ukrainians were very deep in a salient here, and they were trying to take Kopany and Verbova, but those two failed. And now the Russians are just improving their flanks here, and which they did to the west here. So they captured some fields and improved their positions in Robotyne. But besides that, no other changes in the Zaporozhye direction. In the Chasiv Yar direction, I said last week that the Russians have a bridgehead in the western side of the Sovietsky Donetsk Canal, and we got geolocated footage of that. Now we got the Russians attacking, I believe, in this area right here. They were attacking and crossing the canal. They were under attack, but Russian sources are basically saying they do have positions on, have a small bridgehead here, and so depending on we don't know the extent of this bridgehead, but we do know that the Russians have some sort of bridgehead here, and the Russians will probably continue moving and trying to clear what they call the Novi district until they reach the center of Chasiv Yar. They're going to use this rail line and probably reach up to here, and clear and have a solid bridgehead here. So. And we got geolocated footage. Last week it was just some map rumors, but this week we have some confirmations that the Russians are consolidating themselves on the western bank of the canal, which is a good first step. We also have some sources saying the Russians are clearing the fields of the heights of Klishevka. We got some footage showing the Russians were clearing out some Ukrainians on this area right here. So it looks like the Russians aren't in complete control of the Klishevka heights, but it looks like they need to control the heights of Klishevka in order to actually have the dominance over the eastern bank of the canal, because they really want to clear these the fields to the east of this canal so that they could start encircling Chasiv Yar from the south here. But in order to do that, they need to take the Klishevka heights, which are being fought over at this moment. In the Seversk direction, we got some footage showing that the Russians have cleared the hills to the north of Rozdolovka and have taken these fields right here. And this makes sense because now they basically kind of flattened the front line along with after they captured the Vesele hills a few weeks ago, and so they've basically consolidated their gains in Rozdolovka. Some sources are saying the Russians have crossed the rail line here and captured the southern part of Pruneshnia right here. That's possible because they still have the Bakhmutka River to defend themselves. But we have no confirmation of that. But I expect the Russians will probably continue moving north and probably advance, try to take Vimvka, advance along this rail line and, capture Vimvka. And then from there, the Russians will probably try to take Przinia and, the front line, probably have the front line kind of flatten a little bit. And this will get them closer to the southern outskirts or the southern part of Seversk, but they still have a long way to go to get there, but they are making progress towards Seversk here. But so consolidating their gains in the south here. In the Liman direction, the Russians and the Ukrainians are battling over Makivka. We saw some footage of the Russians in the town, then we saw some footage of the Ukrainians getting bombed in Makivka. So it looks like Makivka is in a gray zone. Neither side controls it. From what if you could say the Ukrainians are on the western side of the Zhirbets River, because Makivka is split in half by the river, so the Ukrainians are probably on the western side, the Russians are probably more on the eastern side, but we saw the Russians bombing this area, so it looks like Makivka is still being fought over, and the Russians really want to have solid control of this village so that they could advance to the south and clear out, Nevska, Terny, and, kind of outflank the Ukrainian defenses here. But Makivka is still being fought over. We got some map changes to the more to the north here. We saw that the Ukrainians actually have cleared the fields to the south of Nadia here, and the Russians are so they're getting close to Sigirivka here. There's I think a river right here that helps. So I think maybe it could be possible that the front line is along this river and the Russians are no longer in Sigirivka, but basically, the gains the Russians made here a few months ago have been reversed. But we did get some confirmation that the Russians are in Novigorivka here because they were getting bombed by the Ukrainians here. So it looks like this village is contested. So it looks like Russians are a bit more closer here than we think, but the Ukrainians are closer to the river here than we thought. So there's some flux in this area right here. There's been no change on this direction, but there's still been clashes here. The Russians are still trying to take Stimavka. The Russians are still trying to clear the northern fields here in the south of Berestova. So some clashes here. There's been no changes on the Kupiansk front, which is kind of strange. After it looks like they're still consolidating in Pishana, and we shall see. The only changes I think we got was that the Russians are still trying to consolidate their gains to the east of Sinkovka. Because they really want to consolidate themselves here because, then they'll be able to start attacking Sinkovka and outflank it instead of attacking them directly, which has failed so far because the Russians have been trying to take Sinkovka for months and has been a complete failure. So maybe they're trying to improve their positions to the east here and then storm it from two sides, and then they could take Sinkovka. So we shall see if the Russians could. The Russians have been improving on that. We'll see how that develops. On the Kharkov front, some small changes. Let's talk about the Lipsy front here. We talked about last week how the Russians have completely retook Globoka, and the Ukrainians are now consolidating in Lipsy to retake it. But if the Russians continue holding Globoka, then they can continue holding basically their Lipsy gains here. It was looking kind of dire for the Russians there for a moment, but after the recapture of Globoka from the Ukrainians, the Russians are a bit more better position here. in the Volchansk direction of the Kharkov front. The Ukrainians are trying to basically outflank the Russians from here. They basically are battling for Storitsia. The Russians are bombing this village, so the Ukrainians are in this village. The front line here is kind of in flux. Some sources are now saying that this area is under Ukrainian control, and basically the Ukrainians are trying to move this direction to clear these fields, and because then they could, if they clear Storitsia and Borovka, not only will this cut off any Russian threat from advancing through the fields here and cutting off Volchansk, they'll then be able to start trying to outflank and cut off Volchansk from the Russians in Volchansk from the Russian international border. So they're trying to put pressure on these flanks here, just like they're trying to. The Ukrainians are in complete control of the village of Tivka, which is getting bombed to hell. But the Ukrainians are obviously trying to put up some defense here to try to push the Russians here. And because since this bridgehead is in a precarious position, the Ukrainians are trying to attack on the flanks here and squeeze the Russians out. But so far, there's only been limited gains here, and the Russians can continue with their assaults on Volchansk, which is having some success here because we got some confirmation that the Russians are in control of this high-rise building right here, and so. The Russians are pretty much in the northern, have control of the northern sector of the citadel, but the Ukrainians are in the southern sector. And this citadel is basically what keeps the Russians, or what keeps the Ukrainians on the northern part of Volchansk. I think the Russians right now have given up on taking Volchansk, and what they really want is just to push the front line and make it go along the river here, and just have the northern part of Volchansk. So. That's the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Those were the weekly updates in terms of the changes on the ground. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to my channel to continue receiving these weekly Russian-Ukrainian War updates. Be sure to like this video, share this video around, and comment your thoughts. So aim high and wander on.